The sun rose slow over the plains, spilling light across the wide stretch of land that had once promised abundance, but now offered little more than dust and toil. The rancher leaned against the porch post of his weather-beaten cabin, hat pulled low, eyes scanning the horizon as though searching for an answer that never came. His land stretched far, but it felt smaller with every season that passed. The fences sagged, the soil cracked, the cattle fewer than he could bear to admit. He carried the weight of it all in his shoulders, the lines carved deep in his face. Each morning began the same. He rose before the sky burned orange, pulled on his worn boots, and stepped into the chill of dawn. The smell of earth, of dust and sweat, clung to him like a second skin. He fed what cattle remained, hauled water from the creek, patched the fence posts that always seemed to break faster than they could be mended. His days were filled with work that left no room for rest, yet never seemed to change the truth. He was barely holding on. The neighbors had long since given up on land like his. Some sold, some moved east, some drank themselves into silence. But he stayed, stubborn or foolish, he wasn't sure which. He told himself he could outlast the hardships, that grit and sweat would carry him through. Still, as he sat alone at night, staring into the dying fire, he felt the gnawing emptiness in his chest. The silence in his cabin echoed louder than any storm. The debts pressed against him like a noose. Supplies cost more than he earned, and each trip into town left him with lighter pockets and heavier shame. People whispered, though not always cruelly. They pitied him, the rancher who worked himself to the bone, and yet had nothing to show but scars and an empty table. He ignored them, kept his head down, but the whispers clung like burrs to his pride. It was during one of those trips into town that he first heard about the auction. He had gone only to trade what little he could spare, a sack of beans, a few strips of cured meat. The square buzzed louder than usual, the crowd thick, their voices sharp with curiosity. He pushed through, hat brim low, until he reached the edge. At the center stood a man, though to call him a man seemed almost untrue. He was 39 by age, yet his body bore the marks of labor begun too early and carried too long. His back was bent, his hands calloused, his eyes hollow with years of servitude. He had been sold as a child, forced to toil with no freedom, no rest, no dignity. And now, broken by decades of work that stripped him of youth and hope, he stood on display like cattle. The rancher's chest tightened as he watched. The auctioneer barked out numbers, his voice sharp, but the crowd responded with little more than shrugs. No one wanted the burden of a man already worn down. No one wanted the reminder of cruelty that stretched from boyhood into adulthood. Whispers floated through the crowd, too old, too broken, not worth the coin. The rancher should have walked away. He had no money to spare, no room for another mouth, no reason to add more weight to a life already heavy. Yet he did not move. He stood rooted, eyes fixed on the figure before him. Something stirred in him, something he had not felt in years. A pull, sharp and undeniable. The man on the stage lifted his head once, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. For the briefest moment their eyes met. There was no plea in that look, no begging, no expectation. Only a quiet endurance, a silent statement. This is what I have become, and this is how the world will leave me. The rancher's breath caught, and in that moment he understood. He saw not just a man, but a reflection. Two lives battered by hardship, two souls abandoned to struggle alone. The auctioneer grew impatient, his calls sharper, his gestures wide. Still, no bids came. The rancher felt his heart hammering against his ribs. His mind shouted reason. He had debts. He had no spare coin. He had no plan. But his hand rose all the same, his voice steady as he gave his number. The crowd turned, surprise flashing across faces. The quiet rancher, the man who barely spoke, who barely looked up from his work, had just offered to take what no one else would. The auctioneer slammed his hand down, the deal sealed before another word could be spoken. Murmurs spread through the crowd, some scoffing, some shaking their heads, some pitying his foolishness. But the rancher did not hear them. His eyes remained on the man, who now stepped down from the stage, his movements slow, heavy, as though each step carried the weight of his entire life. When they stood face to face, the rancher saw him clearly. The lines of his face were deep, his shoulders stooped, his hands rough and scarred. But behind the weariness, behind the years of labor that had stripped him of so much, there lingered a spark. Faint, fragile, but real. The rancher extended a hand. The man looked at it, then at him, and for a long moment he did nothing. Finally, he placed his hand in the rancher's, rough palm against rough palm, and nodded once. The rancher did not speak, not then. Words were too small for what had just passed between them. Instead, he led him away from the crowd, past the whispers and stares, toward the waiting horse and the road that stretched back to the ranch. Each step felt heavier than the last, yet also strangely lighter, as though something had shifted in the air. He knew nothing of what lay ahead. He knew only this: his life, worn thin by struggle, had just taken a turn he had never expected. He had spent years working to keep the land alive, but now, for the first time in a long while, he wondered if the land might not be the only thing worth saving. The road home stretched long, the sky wide above them, the dust rising with each step. The rancher glanced once at the man walking beside him, his figure stooped but steady, his face unreadable. He thought of the coins he had given up, of the debts that would press heavier now, of the questions waiting unanswered. Yet deep in his chest, beneath the worry, something stirred, something that felt a little like hope, though he did not yet dare to name it. The journey back to the ranch was long and quiet, the kind of quiet that carried weight rather than peace. The rancher rode slowly, reins loose in his hand, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Beside him walked the man he had just bought, his steps steady but heavy, as though each footfall pressed against memories too deep to speak aloud. The air was dry, filled with dust that clung to their clothes, the sun lowering itself toward the horizon, staining the sky with streaks of gold and fire. The rancher did not know what words could be said. He was not a man given to talking much, and even if he were, he could not imagine what words might mend the years the stranger carried in his shoulders. So he let the silence linger, his horse's hooves striking a steady rhythm, the creak of the saddle filling the spaces between their breaths. The man's face was hard to read. His eyes stayed low, scanning the dirt road rather than the open sky, his hands hanging loose but tense, like they had forgotten how to rest. His body bore the marks of labor, scars across his arms, thick calluses across his palms, lines etched too deep for a man not yet 40. The rancher had seen hard work before. He had lived it. But there was something different here, something sharper, as though every year of his life had been whittled down into servitude until there was nothing left but survival. When the cabin finally came into view, the rancher slowed his horse, watching the man's reaction. The house stood plain against the stretch of prairie, its wood darkened from storms and years of weather. Fences spread around it, some broken, some barely standing. The barn leaned a little to one side, patched more than once. To the rancher it was home. To the man beside him it must have looked like another place to labor, another set of walls to confine him. The rancher dismounted, tying his horse to the post. He glanced at the man, who stood still, shoulders bent slightly, as though waiting for orders. The rancher's chest tightened at the sight. He had not brought him here to be a servant, yet the habits of a life lived in chains were not so easily broken. He gestured toward the cabin, his voice low, rough from disuse. "Go on inside." The man hesitated. His eyes flicked to the door, then back to the rancher, as though trying to read the truth of the command. Finally, he nodded once and stepped forward, his boots dragging faintly against the dirt. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and old pine. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting the room in a soft orange glow. The table sat bare at the center, the chair pulled back from the night before. The bed in the corner was neatly made, though the blanket was thin, patched in places. It was not much, but it was more than many places he had known. The rancher moved past him, setting down the small sack of supplies he had carried from town. He placed bread and beans on the table, then filled the kettle with water from the barrel. He worked in silence, the motions practiced, steady. The man stood by the door, his hands curling and uncurling at his sides as though unsure whether to stay or to flee. Finally, the rancher spoke, his tone flat but not unkind. "You'll eat. Rest too. Work can wait." The man's head lifted slightly, his eyes narrowing, searching for some hidden meaning. He nodded once, but he did not move until the rancher pulled two bowls from the shelf and set them on the table. Only then did he step forward, his movements cautious, his body tense as though prepared for a blow that never came. They ate in silence, the crackle of the fire filling the space between them. The rancher chewed slowly, his eyes fixed on the flames, while the man ate quickly, each bite sharp, as though afraid the food might be taken away. When the bowl was empty, he sat back, his shoulders lowering a fraction, though the tension never fully left his face. The rancher studied him quietly. He saw the scars, the hollow look in his eyes, the way his hands gripped the edge of the table even when there was nothing left to hold. He thought of the years that had shaped those hands, the days that had ground that look into his face. And he thought too of the warning he had given himself. This might be more burden than he could bear. Yet beneath all of that, something else stirred, something that whispered this man was not beyond saving, that perhaps neither of them were. When the fire burned low, the rancher stood and pulled an extra blanket from the shelf. He placed it on the bed, then gestured toward it. The man froze, his eyes darting from the blanket to the rancher, suspicion tightening his face. He seemed to wait for the catch, for the command, for the punishment hidden in the offer. But no such thing came. The rancher only nodded, then settled into the chair by the fire, his hat pulled low over his face. For a long time the man stood there, his body caught between refusal and exhaustion. At last, his shoulders sagged, and he moved slowly to the bed, laying down on top of the blanket rather than beneath it, as though he did not yet believe he had the right to warmth. His breathing slowed, deepened, and before long he slept, his body surrendering to rest for perhaps the first time in years. The rancher sat in the chair, eyes half closed, listening. The sound of another's breathing in his cabin felt strange, almost unsettling but not unwelcome. It filled the silence in a way the crackling fire never could. He leaned back, letting the weight of the day press into him, his mind restless but his body still. Morning came with the call of birds outside, the light spilling pale through the window. The rancher rose, set the kettle to boil, and stepped outside to tend the animals. When he returned, the man was awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, his hands clasped, his eyes low. He rose quickly when the rancher entered, as though afraid of being caught in idleness. The rancher set bread on the table, poured water into a cup, and gestured again. "Eat." The man hesitated, then obeyed, though his eyes flicked toward the door, the window, the rancher's face. It was clear he still did not know what this place was meant to be, or what role he was expected to play. He had lived too long under the weight of commands, of punishments, of fear. Freedom, even in its smallest form, was not something he knew how to carry. As the day stretched on, he began to move without being asked. He fetched water, mended a broken latch, carried wood to the fire. His steps were sure, his work precise, his silence unbroken. The rancher watched him, not stopping him, not pushing him, letting him work as he chose. He noticed how the man's eyes lingered on the cattle, how his hands moved with skill when he repaired the fence, how he seemed to know instinctively what needed doing. Years of labor had not left him without knowledge, though they had left him without voice. That night they ate together again, and once more the silence stretched between them. But this time it felt different, less sharp, less heavy. There was something almost companionable in it, something that hinted at the beginnings of trust. When the fire burned low, the man lay down again on the bed, still on top of the blanket. The rancher settled into his chair, his hat pulled low. And in that quiet, as the night pressed close and the stars burned high above the plains, both men sat in a space that felt different from the lives they had carried before. They did not yet know what it meant. They did not yet know where it would lead. But something had shifted, something that could not be taken back. The days began to fall into a rhythm neither man had expected. The rancher woke as he always did, long before dawn, but now there was another presence moving in the cabin, another set of footsteps stirring the silence. The man he had brought from the auction no longer sat frozen on the edge of the bed waiting for direction. Instead, he rose early, his hands already busy, gathering wood for the fire, fetching water from the barrel, sweeping dust from the floor as though he had lived there for years. The rancher said little, but he noticed. Every movement was precise, every task done with a quiet thoroughness that came from a lifetime of labor. At first, the rancher had been uncertain what role the man would play. He had bought his freedom, not his service, yet the man worked without being told, without question, as though he did not know how to be anything but useful. His silence lingered, but in that silence was a steady rhythm, a kind of loyalty that spoke louder than words. The rancher let him be, understanding that some wounds did not heal with questions but with time. The work on the ranch was endless. Fences sagged, cattle strayed, and the land itself seemed always on the edge of giving up. Yet with two pairs of hands instead of one, the load grew lighter. The man mended boards without being asked, his skill surprising in its detail. He fixed broken tools, his scarred fingers moving with practiced ease. He carried heavy buckets without complaint, dug posts deep into the ground, lifted beams onto his shoulders, as though they weighed less than they did. The rancher, watching, began to see that the strength carved into him by years of child labor was not all loss. There was resilience there, endurance and skill that could not be beaten out of him no matter how many years had been stolen. Meals, once solitary, became shared moments. The rancher boiled beans or roasted meat over the fire, and the man sat across from him, eating slowly now instead of with frantic haste. He had begun to believe the food would not be taken from him, that there would be more tomorrow. Sometimes their eyes met across the table, brief glances that held more than either dared to speak. There was no friendship yet, not fully, but there was the beginning of something steadier, something that felt like trust forming in the spaces where silence used to echo. Outside, the ranch shifted too. The cattle seemed calmer with two men tending them. The fences, though still battered by storms and wind, stood straighter, firmer, when built by four hands instead of two. The barn that leaned dangerously to one side grew stronger as they lifted beams and nailed boards side by side. And though the land still stretched wide and unyielding, it felt less like an enemy and more like a challenge they faced together. The rancher found himself watching the man when he worked. He saw how his shoulders straightened little by little, how his steps grew surer, how the hollowness in his eyes began to fade. The man still spoke little, but when he did, his voice was rough, low, carrying weight in every word. The first time he offered a simple "fence holds now," the rancher felt something stir deep inside him. It was not just the words, but the fact that they had been spoken at all. It was proof that silence could give way, that trust could grow from nothing. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, they sat by the fire, the warmth casting shadows across the walls. Sometimes the rancher sharpened his knife. Sometimes the man mended leather or carved a small piece of wood with careful hands. They did not fill the air with words, but the silence no longer felt sharp. It felt shared, comfortable, as though they both understood it was enough simply to be there. One evening, a storm rolled in. The wind howled across the plains, rattling the shutters, slamming against the walls. Rain poured heavy, seeping through cracks, soaking the earth outside until it turned to mud. The cattle cried in the distance, restless and afraid. The rancher pulled on his coat and rose to go out, but before he could speak, the man was already on his feet, pulling on boots, reaching for a lantern. Their eyes met in the dim light, no words exchanged, but the understanding was clear. Together, they stepped into the storm. Lightning split the sky, thunder shook the ground, and rain beat against their faces, but they moved side by side through the chaos. They herded the cattle back toward shelter, shouting over the wind, guiding the frightened animals into the barn. Mud clung to their boots, Water soaked their clothes, but they did not stop. When the last gate slammed shut, when the final animal was safe, they stood there in the downpour, breathless, soaked, yet steady. The rancher glanced at him, rain dripping from his hat brim, and for the first time in years he let out a low laugh. The man, quiet for so long, allowed the corner of his mouth to twitch upward. It was fleeting, small, but it was real. Back inside, dripping and exhausted, they sat by the fire, steam rising from their wet clothes. The rancher poured 2 cups of coffee, slid one across the table. The man took it, his scarred hands wrapped around the warm tin. They drank in silence, but in that silence was a bond forged not by words but by shared struggle, by survival side by side. Over time, more small changes came. The man began to speak short sentences, offering observations about the cattle, about the weather, about the work. He began to hum faintly when mending leather, a tune half forgotten but carried from somewhere deep in his past. The rancher listened, never interrupting, never pressing for more, but he noticed. He noticed too the way his cabin no longer felt like a hollow shell but like a place lived in. The table bore the marks of shared meals. The tools were cared for by 2 sets of hands. The fire burned brighter with the weight of another's presence. The rancher did not think of himself as a savior. He had not bought the man to rescue him. But as the days turned into weeks, he began to see that perhaps they had rescued each other. The man, once hollow, carried life back into the rancher's world. And the rancher, once resigned to solitude, now found purpose in more than just keeping the land alive. There were nights when the rancher lay awake, listening to the sound of another's breathing in the cabin, and felt something he had not felt in years. A sense of belonging. A sense that the silence which once crushed him was no longer his burden alone. He thought back to the auction sometimes, to the moment their eyes had met, to the spark he had seen there. He realized now that spark had not been imagined. It was growing, steady and sure, in every repaired fence, in every shared meal, in every unspoken moment that tied them closer. The ranch was still struggling. The debts had not vanished, the storms still came, the land still demanded everything of them. But the burden no longer felt impossible. The work was still hard, the nights still long, but the weight was halved when carried together. And in that shared weight, something else was being built, something quiet, steady, and unbreakable. The season shifted slowly, the way it always did on the plains. The mornings grew cooler, the nights longer, the grass faded from green to gold. Work never stopped, but it began to change. The fences that once leaned now stood straight, the barn no longer sagged, and the cattle grazed more peacefully than they had in years. The ranch was still far from thriving, but it no longer felt like it was crumbling. Each day, little by little, the place took on a strength that matched the men who worked it. The man who had arrived broken from the auction no longer carried himself with the same stoop. His shoulders had straightened, his steps had grown firmer, his eyes less hollow. The weight of years had not vanished, but something had softened in him, as if the chains of his past no longer bound him as tightly. He had begun to speak more, not with many words, but with enough to fill the silence that had once stretched heavy across the cabin. Short sentences at first, then a few more. Observations about the land, about the sky, about the way the cattle moved. Each word seemed like a stone laid between them, building a bridge from one soul to another. The rancher noticed every change. He noticed the way the man now sat at the table without hesitation, the way he reached for food knowing there would be enough, the way he looked out at the horizon not with fear but with quiet thought. He noticed too how the ranch felt different when they worked side by side. The chores that had once left him bone-tired now felt lighter, not because the work had lessened, but because it was no longer carried alone. They began to share more than just the labor. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they sat by the fire, their tools set aside, their bodies weary but their spirits steadier. The rancher sometimes told small stories of storms he had survived, of cattle drives that stretched for miles, of neighbors long gone. The man listened, his eyes steady, his silence not empty but attentive. Sometimes, after a long pause, he spoke too. His stories were not of triumph but of survival, days of toil in fields, nights of cold floors, the years of being treated less than human. His voice did not carry anger, only a tired truth, the kind that did not need embellishment. The rancher never interrupted. He listened, and in that listening, trust grew deeper. The children of the prairie noticed the change too. When they passed by the ranch, they no longer saw only one figure working the land but two. Whispers spread quietly through town that the quiet rancher had brought a man back from the auction, that together they were making something of the land. Some said it was foolish, others said it was strange, but a few saw what it really was, a kind of redemption unfolding on dusty soil. One evening, after a long day of mending fences, the two men stood together at the edge of the field, the sky burning with the colors of sunset. The rancher leaned against the post, his hands rough, his body tired but his eyes softer than they had been in years. The man stood beside him, his face turned toward the horizon, the light catching on the lines that hardship had carved deep. Neither spoke for a long while. The air was filled with the chirp of crickets, the lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through dry grass. Then the man said quietly, almost as if to himself, "This place, it feels alive." The rancher turned his head, studying him, then gave a slow nod. He did not need to say more. They both felt it. The ranch was no longer just land to be fought against. It had become a home, a place where broken things could take root and grow again. As the days turned colder, they worked to prepare for winter. Together they stacked wood high against the cabin wall, patched the roof with fresh shingles, and laid hay thick in the barn for the cattle. The man's hands moved with practiced strength, his body no longer faltering under the weight of labor. The rancher watched him often, not with suspicion as he had at first, but with a kind of quiet pride. He had not expected this transformation. He had not expected to find himself changed too. Nights grew colder, but the cabin stayed warmer than it ever had. The fire burned brighter, the meals stretched further, the silence filled not with emptiness but with presence. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. But always there was the steady knowledge that neither of them faced the night alone. There was a night when the wind howled fierce outside, rattling the shutters and slamming against the walls. The rancher lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. Across the room, the man shifted in his own space, his breathing steady. The rancher thought of the warning the man had once carried in his eyes, the warning that taking him in would bring regret. He thought of how wrong that warning had been, not because there had been no struggle, but because the struggle had given them both something greater than they had expected. He did not speak the thought aloud, but he felt it deep in his bones. The following morning, the sun rose clear and frost sparkled across the fields. The rancher stepped outside, his breath white in the air, and saw the man already at work, carrying buckets of water, his steps sure against the frozen ground. The sight filled him with a warmth that reached deeper than the fire inside. It was the sight of a man no longer bowed by his past, of a ranch no longer standing on the edge of ruin, of a life that, against all odds, had begun to take root again. Day after day they built something together. They built it not with grand gestures or loud declarations, but with steady hands, shared labor, and quiet trust. The ranch grew stronger. The men grew stronger. And though neither spoke the words aloud, both knew they had found something more than survival. They had found a bond, a kind of family forged not by blood but by choice, by endurance, by the simple act of refusing to let each other face the weight of the world alone. The land stretched wide around them, the sky endless above, the work unending. But in the midst of it, in the small cabin that had once echoed with silence, life had returned. And for the first time in years, perhaps for the first time ever, both men carried not just the weight of survival but the quiet strength of belonging.